G'day everyone, welcome back to the channel. So in today's video, I want to talk you guys through almost a hidden underlying cause of almost all anterior shoulder pain. So pain at the front of the shoulder. And what we'll do as well here is we'll go through one or two exercises to hopefully help you reclaim that function that sort of we lose that tends to set you up for anterior shoulder pain. And then as always, we want to put that into context and talk about why all this happens in the first place, so that hopefully you've got a really clear understanding as to what the root cause of it is and then how to fix it beyond just looking at the front of your shoulder. So before we get into it, obviously, if you do go on to enjoy the video, please let me know in the comments below. Tell me how your shoulder's going. What are you dealing with? How long have you had it for? You know, what things have you tried and haven't tried? Or what information are you hoping to get from these videos? And it's really useful because I take that information, just like I do the real world conversations I have with my patients, and try and sort of put it into a video that's hopefully helpful and highly effective for you guys. And on top of that, if you are happy to leave a like below in the video, and please consider subscribing to the channel if you're new, and if you are someone who enjoys thinking about the body this way. As I said, the videos and the content that I'm trying to put out here is just based on conversations, everyday conversations that I have with my patients, hopefully trying to work with them to solve their dysfunction long term. And I've always had this view that the conversations I have with one patient are probably the same conversations that we need to be having with tens of thousands of other people in terms of how common these conversations are. So if you'd like to learn a little bit more about your body, maybe how to prevent your injuries, what causes them, what exercises you can do, potentially ones that you may not have heard of before, maybe try and find that missing piece to your puzzle, then please consider subscribing and just join me on this journey. So with that being said, when we're talking about anterior shoulder pain, I think the most important thing to consider about anterior shoulder pain, which for a lot of people who don't know, it can be anything from a biceps tendonitis, maybe a bursitis, maybe one of the anterior rotator cuff tendons, that subscapularis. There's some ligaments in the area, there's soft tissue all around it. It can be some non-specific aches and pains, tightness, just any dysfunction at the front of that shoulder. Is generally caused by the same common root issue. And this same conversation goes for anyone who's had some trauma, whether they've had a fall or a knock that you feel has given you your shoulder pain at the front of that shoulder. You guys are still included in this conversation because in your instances, we often assume that tissue has a finite tolerance, and of course it does, but when you hurt yourself, we often feel like that tissue was perfect before you went into that issue, and the trauma or the force that trauma produced through the shoulder exceeds the natural tissue tolerance and then causes an injury or dysfunction, which makes perfect sense on a lot of levels. But when we take a step back, what we often find clinically, or at least I'm finding clinically, is that most people who tend to have those issues may take a compromised mechanical tissue or some compromised mechanical systems into that moment, which has robbed you of your ability to buffer that injury and that issue. So it often can be the difference between going into something and coming out of it intact or being injured. So please consider these issues or this same conversation for you guys. It basically encompasses almost everything that happens to the front of that shoulder, traumatically or just in general play. So getting into it, I guess the one thing that we need to talk about, I think that's really, really important here is how free or how much internal rotation you have at your shoulder. Now, this won't be a surprise to a lot of people, but it's the compensation that happens when you lack internal rotation of the shoulder, which I think is a really key element that's often missed for a lot of anterior shoulder pain. And for anyone who doesn't know, what I mean by that is, when we're talking about rotation at the shoulder, when your elbows are by your side, external rotation is clearly when your forearms rotate outwards. And we should have somewhere close to about 90 degrees of rotation in those shoulders. If we were to have our arms up at about 90 degrees, it looks more like an externally rotated position. Again, that goalpost position, 90 degrees, if not more, depending on how flexible your shoulders could be. So when we're talking about internal rotation, we're talking about the opposite. So the ability to rotate those forearms inwards. So if your elbows are by your sides, clearly you run into your trunk. So this often sort of epitomizes getting your hands behind your back and being able to lift that hand off your back. In this position, if that's external rotation, clearly internal rotation is the same thing. So going down in the opposite direction. Now, again, what a lot of people don't realize here is that you should have about 90 degrees of internal rotation in this position as well. And for me at the moment, I don't know if you can see this from side on, and take note of this because when we go through the exercise, we'll hopefully see this improve. So my internal rotation here is, I'm not quite at 90 degrees there. I'm probably about sort of 75 to 80 degrees, and both sides feel relatively similar. And the reason why this is important is because it's what happens when you try and gain more rotation, that your shoulder has to compromise its position in order to do that. So if we value, say, 90 degrees, and I can only get to, say, here, for example, the only way that I can get further in this range of motion is if I let my shoulder dump forwards. And this is the key component that gets missed a lot, is that if you see someone with anterior shoulder pain, or you're someone with anterior shoulder pain, what we miss is that they're often in this shoulder position. And we always talk about shoulders back and working your scapular stabilizers and strengthening your rotator cuff. But that position is often a consequence of lacking that internal rotation. So the position that the shoulder is always functioning in, instead of it being in a great shoulders back position, it's often in that rotated forward position, which is, hopefully, as you can see, clearly changes the way that we load that tissue. So if you're someone who uses your arms a lot and you do that from a good position, then clearly you have full access to all of your tissues, all the stabilization mechanisms, everything's loaded the way that it should. But if you're lacking that internal rotation and your shoulder's in this position more often, all of a sudden you've changed the way that you load up that entire system, opening it up for problems down the track if you find yourself in an environment that can expose that. And for someone who might fall and have some trauma through that shoulder and then cause their problems, your shoulder is much better equipped to handle that in a better position than it is if it's already compromised before you hit the ground and something goes wrong. So it's often one of the reasons why we see a lot of collarbone breaks, AC joint dislocations, all those sorts of things can often be because this position is nowhere near good enough. So knowing that is really important, because then we can start to devise a plan to take you from someone who, say, you can only get to here and then everything else is just pure scapular movements and dumping that shoulder forwards, to someone who can keep your shoulder back and comfortably rotate to a certain point. So again, for me, I can probably get to, what's that, maybe, as I said, probably 75 degrees on a good day. But we want to show you an exercise that I think is really helpful, or two exercises that are really helpful for this, that you can do anytime, anywhere. If you have shoulder pain while you're doing this, then obviously we need to make sure that your position is perfect, and you should never be feeling any pain through the front of the shoulder while you're doing this exercise. So the first version is one I think we've done before on the channel, but I think it's really, really important here. So hopefully you can see this, but we want to basically put you in an internally rotated position, but with your shoulder being back. So again, if your shoulder blades are back, and then we want to basically rotate your forearm down until you feel like your shoulder wants to lift up off the ground. So, and then we want to put your hips up, slide those hands underneath. So again, you don't have to go all the way up the top if you can't get there. You might be starting down low here, but the priority is that those shoulders stay back on the ground, so that when you drop your hips down, essentially forcing that shoulder into more internal rotation, you need to stop as soon as you feel like you've come to the end of that tension. So again, if you have any pain at the front of the shoulder while you're doing this, then you've gone down too far, or your shoulders aren't in a good enough position to begin with. So again, you might have to start up quite high and just come down slowly until you feel some gentle tightness through the, sort of around the side of the shoulder as opposed to the front. You can almost do the same thing up against the wall if you want to, but it is a little bit more awkward to do that. So that's the first one. And even just doing that for me to begin with, hopefully you can see just from doing that for a short amount of time, things feel a bit looser, even if it doesn't look obviously further than it did before. But the main exercise that I wanted to go through is one that it probably doesn't really have a name, but it's a position that I like to use a lot with my patients. And I think you could probably call it if anything, a chicken wing exercise. It'll make sense why in a second, but again, we're prioritizing keeping your shoulder back, going to the end of your internal rotation, and then trying to gently make that go further in a respectful way without annoying the front of the shoulder. So for me, how I like to do this, and again, you can do this standing quite easily, is what I get my patients to do is shoulders back first, and then hand on your hip. So again, making sure that that shoulder doesn't want to dump forwards. So shoulders back, hand on your hip, and then you want to come up against a wall or a door frame and have your elbow sort of pressing on that wall. And then what we want to get you to do is, keeping your shoulder back, you want to rotate your trunk around towards that elbow. And what this does, and for me, I like to sort of, instead of having a hand on your hip, I like to have my hand behind to add a little bit more leverage here, is we're using the leverage of the wall, or in this case, the door, in a good position to rotate around, not allowing that shoulder to dump forward and challenge the front of the shoulder. It's a really powerful way to find some tightness around the side and at the back of that shoulder. And we're basically forcing you more into internal rotation using the leverage of the door to do that. And again, what I like to do here is, wherever it feels tight, just try and squeeze that tightness as best as possible. That can mean gently pushing your elbow back into the wall, hold it for a few seconds, then relax. See if you can go around a little bit further than before. Again, making sure to stay up nice and tall and not sort of slouch and round off. We want absolute ideal loading of that shoulder so that we're keeping the injured, irritated tissue out of the equation. Coming to a point where we feel some tightness around the side, potentially the back. Again, tensing up that tightness, gently pushing the elbow back into the wall if need be, holding that for 5, relaxing and coming around again until you feel like you've made some change with that tissue. And then what you'll hopefully find in a very short amount of time is, again, if you put yourself in a good position, have your elbows up and then rotate down again, hopefully you'll see that straight away that's going further than before. I don't feel like I need to dump my shoulder forward. My shoulder's relatively back there. Again, it's not quite to 90 degrees just yet, but it's closer than what it was before, or at the very least, it feels looser than it did before for me. So if you guys can try that at home, it's a really, really simple way to improve the amount of rotation in that shoulder, allow you to keep your shoulder back and separate that movement without your shoulder needing to dump forward and challenging and sort of compromising all that tissue at the front of the shoulder. So as I said, it's a really, really important concept, because if you're just treating the front of the shoulder and you're not working hard to keep that shoulder back in a better position, feeding more slack into that area via that internal rotation, then you're potentially missing the entire bigger picture of why that shoulder's become sore in the first place. And if you're just doing your rotator cuff exercises, like your strength exercises, your scapular stabilizers, maybe working on your postural habits and things like that, and you're not also working on that internal rotation, you're leaving a lot of low-hanging fruit on the table that could be the missing piece to your puzzle that makes you feel better really quickly, but also stops it from coming back in the future. So again, those two exercises, the one lying on the ground and the one, I guess the chicken wing exercise as well, I find really, really beneficial to help you sort of claw back some of that internal rotation and improve the way that you load that up. So again, those exercises are helpful, quite effective in my opinion. The final thing that I wanted to talk about is often something that we cover a lot on the channel, but it's really important for this to make sure that you understand the entire process that happens here in terms of getting that anterior shoulder pain. And for me, the single biggest reason why we end up with anterior shoulder pain via a lack of internal rotation is quite simply due to the postures that we get into day to day. So again, this hopefully won't be news to anyone. Hopefully this is a boring conversation for you guys, but it's a really important one nonetheless. So what I find a lot clinically is that the reason why the tissue at the back of the shoulder and the side of the shoulder gets tight, among a whole host of other things that we haven't touched on, is simply because we get into a position, or we let ourselves get into a position where we're hanging off that tissue long term. And the reason why we lose that internal rotation is not necessarily because we're not doing this all the time, although that can be a part of the broader picture. It's because these positions, that slouchy rolled forward position, directly hangs off of a lot of the tissues that we need to be mobile in order to complete that. And because we hang off those tissues a lot, and again, if it's your right arm, then it can be the mouse hand, it can be laptop fingers, it can be phones, whatever it is, it can be driving depending on who you are. It can be sitting up in bed reading a book, it doesn't really matter what it is. But you've got to pick up on those shapes where you're bringing yourself out of those sort of really beautiful shoulder postures into more slouchy, compromised shapes, which over time ask the tissues that we need to stay mobile to get tight because of the weight of the arm against gravity. So the point of all this conversation, I guess, is that we want to make sure that you can improve that internal rotation in a number of different ways, two of which I find are really helpful that we've just gone through. But if you're not then consciously trying to keep your shoulders back in a better position, then that tightness is going to keep coming back, or at least be hard to shift quickly, meaning that the end result of all this is that chain reaction of either having anterior shoulder pain or being vulnerable enough to have an accident to receive anterior shoulder pain at some stage. So again, I hope that information was really useful. It's a really important concept that I don't think is spoken about enough with shoulder pain in general. And hopefully those exercises are really helpful. So as always, if you found that useful, please let me know in the comments below. More than happy to discuss things further if you need be. Please leave a like if you enjoyed the video, and please consider subscribing if you want to support the channel, help us grow, and obviously sort of keep up to date with these videos as they come out. So as always, I appreciate you guys watching, and we'll see you next time.